What's going on, Hokie Nation? Happy Friday, and as always, welcome into the video edition of the TSL Q&A. Although Virginia Tech's on a bye week, don't you worry, we still got you covered with all your burning questions. I'm Robert Bateman. On set with us is lead columnist and analyst Chris Coleman, and behind the scenes, clicking the keys, is Nick Brown. As always, Chris, you ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, so we'll start with Hokie West, who was wondering, why aren't Heath and or Turner-Bradshaw getting more PT? I realize Lane is really good and it takes up a lot of snaps at slot, but it seems like we could find a way to get these guys involved. Turner-Bradshaw definitely made the most of his few touches last season. I'm assuming he's a strong candidate to transfer. Is Heath hurt?
Yeah, all good questions. I think the first thing we have to realize is that Turner-Bradshaw, he only played maybe 30 or 40 snaps last year. He did have a big play on a reverse that everybody remembers, but he was passed by Heath in the preseason, so he's the third-team slot receiver, and Tech doesn't really throw the ball enough to use more than two slot receivers. We saw Heath early in the season. We saw him on that end around against Vanderbilt, I believe, and he looked very, very quick, and I think he has one catch since, and he's just not in there very much. So, yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't quite have an answer for it. I know that they don't, they've got four receivers out there that they trust, and, Lane can play or plays primarily in the slot, but you'll also see them line other guys up in the slot at all. It just doesn't seem like they're too interested in taking that top group off the field.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Turner-Bradshaw, 4 carries last year for 73 yards and that 47-yard run against NC State for the touchdown. Heath, only 2 touches this year, a catch for 5 yards and that end around for 6 yards.
Yeah, so. And it's interesting, when I write an article in the preseason every year where I go around and I ask Virginia Tech upperclassmen what young player in the program is standing out to you the most, and a few guys said Heath. Takye Heath was the guy that was standing out, like how quick he was, how dynamic he is with the ball in his hands. But we just haven't really had a chance to see that very much this year for whatever reason, and I don't quite have an answer for that.
And as far as the transfer portal part of that question goes, do you think either of those guys would leave at the end of the season?
I mean, I've heard that someone has been tampering with Turner-Bradshaw since basically the day he got set foot on campus at Virginia Tech. I'll leave it to everyone to guess who that is, but it would these days nothing surprises me.
Yeah,
I don't believe that Heath is going anywhere. Lane is a senior, so right now, if the season started in January, then he would be the starting slot receiver.
Yep.
So I don't anticipate him going anywhere because he's a guy who would be entering his redshirt sophomore next season and would certainly be in line for more playing time then.
All right, well, we'll keep it going with a Q&A regular. Kay Pileski, who wanted to know, is there anything positive and or anything to look forward to in the remaining 2 games of the season and going into the offseason for Virginia Tech football team and this program?
As far as the offseason goes, I think the mood of the fan base into the offseason is somewhat tied to what happens in these last 2 games. I think if Virginia Tech wins these last 2 games, then Brent Pry will be able to look at big donors and he'll be able to look at recruits and say, look, we improved by 1 game over last year. Maybe not quite as much as people were hoping we were, but we did improve. And that would be a factual statement. That said, I don't think... Even a 7-5 record, unless they won a bowl game too, I don't think that would necessarily inspire the fan base and the donors and recruits going into the offseason, in my opinion. I think most of the damage has been done by now, although if Tech lost one of these last 2 and they didn't improve on their record, I think more pitchforks would be out, so to speak. I'm kind of looking for these last 2 games. First of all, you want to see the team continue to be engaged, and that's never been an issue under Brent Pry. Even at the worst of times, they've always continued to play very hard, so I have no reason to doubt them going out there and playing hard against Duke next week. The other thing you worry about right now this time of year is we're coming up close to the transfer portal, which means tampering season is in full effect. And you saw Lane Kiffin talking about that this week, and he was basically saying, when you've got other teams hitting up your players behind the scenes, it can be hard to keep them mentally focused. So, it could be the case That could happen to anybody. Could happen to Virginia Tech, or it might not happen to Virginia Tech. The good news for Virginia Tech is they've got a whole bunch of seniors, right? So it's like you can't really, no point in tampering with the seniors because they can't come back. I'm looking for individual performances too. A guy like young players, like Aiden Green, continuing to make progress. Dante Lovett. There's a guy like Keelan Adams start to get some reps at wide receiver. Those are kind of the things I'm looking for. But the main thing for me, honestly, is like what happens in December. Like, will there be any staff changes? Like that's a more important question than who wins the Virginia Tech Duke game, or even who wins the Virginia Tech UVA game. So, part of my mind, yes, I'm looking forward to these last two games because they're football games and you want to win them. But part of my mind is already fast forward into December and what's going to happen then.
Virginia Tech only a win away from being bowl eligible, and as Chris mentioned, those last two games are at Duke this weekend and the following weekend at home inside Lane Stadium, and the Commonwealth Clash against UVA. Now, the last question I want to ask you is, how bad has the season really been? If we date all the way back to the start of the year, before any games have been played, and I told you Virginia Tech would lose on the road in OT against a Vanderbilt squad that beat Alabama, and then get upset by Rutgers at home, lose to Miami on the last play of the game, fall to Syracuse inside the Dome in overtime without Drones or Tootin, and Virginia Tech couldn't upset ranked Clemson, you'd probably be fine with all those losses except for Rutgers.
I think there's two things that bother me this year. Three things. Two individual losses and one trend. Two trends, actually. So let's say four things. First of all, Virginia Tech, I don't believe, should have lost to Rutgers at home. In hindsight, knowing what we know about Rutgers. And they should not have blown a 21-3 lead at Syracuse. I mean, if you'd told me they would score 31 points at Syracuse, be balanced, 455 yards of offense, control the clock, I would have taken that with Tootin and Drones, much less with the backups. So that was a defensive blown game right there. I don't think it had much to do with the offense. So those two individual games bother me. I think Virginia Tech should be 7-3 right now. Another thing that bothers me is for the second year in a row, Tech just playing bad football the first 4 weeks of the season. Like, even when Tech won in September, they didn't look good. I mean, it took them a half. I mean, the ODU game was 14-10 at halftime. Right. The Marshall game was close at halftime. They couldn't pass the football in those games, with the exception of the second half against Vanderbilt. You're down 17-0 against Vanderbilt because you just the Vanderbilt defensive staff manipulates you into running the plays that they want you to run for an entire half of football. I mean, Vanderbilt beat Alabama. They also lost to Georgia State, who's won 2 games this year, right? So they're one of those teams that they can sneak up and get you, but they're also bad enough to lose to Georgia State. Tech played one half of football against them and lost. So that's a trend that is troubling. 2 years in a row playing poor football for the first 4 weeks of the season, and then 0-4 in one-score games. I think the Duke game is going to be close. At least on paper, it should be close. Duke's got a great defense, second in the country in turnovers forced, 15th in yards per play allowed. You don't see Virginia Tech going down there and blowing Duke out because of how good Duke's defense is. So it seems like it's going to be another close game. And Duke is 4-1 in one-score games this year, and Virginia Tech, I believe, is 0-4. So yeah, it's those four things: those two individual losses and those two trends. Like, even if Tech wins these last 2 games, you're always going to be left wondering, what if? What if you're a 500 team in one-score games, which I think should be the goal. There's a certain level of luck involved in one-score games. You're never going to win all of them, win half of them, right?
At the end of the day, losing all 4, you're
right. And, okay. and only one such win in the prior era. Yeah. And that was against a Liberty team whose coaching staff already had 1 foot out the door. Yeah. So it's those trends: not starting the season well, losing almost all your one-score games. That even if Tech won these last 2, I would still see troubling trends within the program that would indicate to me that something has to change.
Well, that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you guys, as always, for your suggestions, and make sure to check out the actual article Q&A edition on TechSideline.com. As always, thank you to Nick Brown behind the set, Chris Coleman on set. I'm Robert Bateman, and we'll see you guys next week.